Sarah Grayson has always been the soul of the small town of Sandwood. Her bright smile and cheerfulness seemed an integral part of everyday life in this quiet place. Friends and acquaintances saw in her a symbol of innocence and youth, a bright beacon illuminating the path for all who knew her. However, what happened to Sarah was the most shocking event for Sandwood in the entire history of its existence. On the evening of September 15th, after meeting friends at a local diner, Sarah returned home. She was always punctual, and when she was not at home the next morning, her father immediately sensed something was wrong. Search parties were organized immediately, and it soon became clear that this was not just another case of a teenager deciding to run away for a couple of days. Her father, James Grayson, was overcome with anxiety and fear when searchers discovered her body in a dense forest several miles from the city. Sarah's death was not just a surprise, but a real shock. It seemed that the whole city froze in horror, unable to believe that someone could do such a thing in their quiet and peaceful corner. Her body was found in a terrible state, indicating severe violence. All life in Sandwood seemed to stop. The usual sounds and rhythms were replaced by heavy silence and oppressive silence. Suspicions quickly began to spread among local residents. Questions to which no one could find an answer were in the air. Who could be capable of such a thing? Why Sarah? What could she have done to make herself so angry? These unanswered questions began to erode the trust on which this town was built. James Grayson was devastated, and his grief was visible to everyone. He lost not only his daughter, but also the meaning of his life. His closest friend, Mike Donovan, was always there to support James during this difficult time. Mike had known Sarah since childhood, and her death felt like an equally personal blow. However, no one, not even Mike, could have foreseen what would happen next. The murder of Sarah Grayson began a chain of events that would change Sandwood forever. In a city where everyone knew each other, fear began to spread. Someone among them turned out to be capable of a terrible crime, and this shadow hung over the entire city. But the most terrible question remained unanswered. Who was behind this murder? And why did the person whom everyone trusted hide his true nature? Only time and carefully hidden secrets could reveal the truth, which turned out to be worse than the worst assumptions. The September morning began like any other, but for Sarah Grayson, this day was the last of her life. She woke up that day with the usual feeling of anticipation. She already had plans in her head for the evening, meeting friends at a local diner, discussing future plans, exchanging news, and of course the usual teenage conversations about dreams and hopes. Sarah was always the favorite of her friends. Her natural goodwill and cheerfulness attracted people to her. Everyone knew that Sarah was the one who would always support and cheer up. Her entire day was scheduled minute by minute: college classes, a short meeting with her best friend Jenny, and then an evening trip to the diner. The diner was one of the few places in Sandwood where young people could get together. That evening, the atmosphere in the establishment was especially warm. Laughter, jokes, and conversations echoed throughout the room. Sarah was sitting at a table surrounded by friends, and there was no sign of trouble. They ordered the usual burgers and milkshakes, discussed plans for the coming weekend, and no one could imagine that for Sarah these plans would never come true. Her father, James Grayson, expected her home at 10 p.m. as usual. James was strict about safety, and Sarah always followed this rule. But this time she was late. It was already almost 11, and Sarah was still not at home. James began to get nervous, but calmed himself with the thought that she was just staying with her friends. However, when another half hour passed and there was no news, anxiety began to develop into panic. Meanwhile, Sarah, still smiling after meeting her friends, walked through the dark streets of Sandwood. The town, as usual, plunged into the silence of the night. Her thoughts were occupied with pleasant memories of the past evening, but she could not help but notice how the shadows around her became thicker and the night air colder. At one of the intersections, a familiar voice called out to her. It was Mike Donovan, her father's friend, whom she had known all her life. Mike was one of those people who always earned her respect and trust. He offered to give her a ride home, and Sarah, not seeing anything unusual in this, agreed. There was a strange silence in Mike's car, and Sarah noticed that he was somewhat nervous. However, she decided not to attach any importance to this. They were driving through a wooded area, and when Mike suddenly turned off the road, Sarah felt her heart clench with unexpected fear. She tried to understand what was happening, but Mike, at first glance calm and balanced, suddenly changed. There was a strange gleam in his eyes that Sarah had never seen before. Her attempt to understand and ask questions ended in a sudden outbreak of violence. What happened next was so terrifying that Sarah could not scream or call for help. All her strength went into resistance, but Mike was stronger. She tried to fight, but her every movement was a death throes, an attempt to escape from inevitable death. The night swallowed her cries. The forest became a silent witness to her last moments, and then there was complete silence. Mike, his face contorted with horror at what he had done, looked at what was left of the girl he had known since childhood. Her lifeless body lay in the grass, and realizing what he had done, Mike froze for a moment. But instead of giving up or calling for help, he began to think about how to hide his crime. He quickly collected his thoughts and decided to hide Sarah's body further in the forest, hoping that no one would find it. He cleared the car of all traces, returned home, and tried to act as if nothing had happened. However, he could not shake the feeling that every glance at him, every word spoken to him was directed in his direction with suspicion. The death of Sarah Grayson that evening marked the beginning of a tragedy in Sandwood that would destroy the lives of many people. But no one except Mike knew yet that the person they trusted the most was behind this tragedy. The next morning, the silence that shrouded Sandwood was shattered by an eerie discovery. A local hunter, Ben Harper, set out into the forest at dawn, as he did every week. For him, it was an ordinary morning, filled with fresh air and the smell of damp earth, until he came across something that made his heart skip a beat. Deep in the forest, hidden under branches and leaves, lay the lifeless body of Sarah Grayson. Ben recoiled in horror, realizing what he had just stumbled upon. He immediately rushed back to the city to report his terrible discovery. The police arrived at the scene shortly after the call. The officers, accustomed to minor crimes and the occasional theft, were shocked by what appeared before their eyes. Sarah's body was brutally mutilated, and it became obvious that she did not just die by accident. It was cold-blooded murder. Detective Lena Hale, who led the investigation, arrived on the scene with a team of forensic scientists. Lena was an experienced specialist, but even she was not easily shaken. However, the sight of this crime left her speechless for several moments. Sarah was just a young girl, and the way she died was unspeakably cruel. The crime scene examination did not leave much evidence. The killer clearly thought through his actions carefully. The only thing that could be found were a few shoe prints leading from the place where the body lay towards the road. Lena realized that this matter would be difficult and every step had to be carefully considered. Soon the entire Sandwood police force was working on the case. Officers began canvassing homes and interviewing residents, trying to find out who might have seen or heard anything suspicious the night Sarah went missing. But the town was quiet, and no one seemed to know anything. This added to the sense of fear and anxiety that had begun to grip Sandwood. When the news of Sarah's death spread throughout the city, horror settled in the hearts of the residents. Parents who just yesterday calmly let their children go outside now did not let them leave the house. Doors began to be bolted earlier than usual, and residents avoided even familiar faces. Someone among them was capable of something so cruel that it seemed incredible. James Grayson was heartbroken. He sat in his living room, unable to believe that his only daughter would never return home. Her room remained untouched, as if she could return at any moment. But James knew that wouldn't happen. Mike Donovan, his best friend, was next to him, trying to support him, but Mike himself, hiding his true feelings, experienced inner horror. Meanwhile, Lena continued to collect evidence and interview everyone who knew Sarah. Her detective instincts told her that someone in Sarah's inner circle, someone she trusted, was behind this crime. But so far, all the evidence seemed to be contradictory, and none of it gave a clear answer. Sarah's funeral was another blow for the city. All the residents of Sandwood gathered for the ceremony to say goodbye to the girl who was a symbol of innocence and kindness. James's face was petrified, and only those close to him could notice how he was struggling to hold back his tears. Mike stood nearby, his gaze full of bitterness, but no one knew that inside him there was a struggle between guilt and fear of exposure. After the funeral, the city seemed even quieter than usual. Residents began to suspect each other, and Lena continued to work on the investigation, trying to put together the scattered pieces of this creepy puzzle. Some of them knew more than they said, and Lena was sure that the truth was about to come to light. But who was it? And what made this man commit such a terrible crime? The answers to these questions remained hidden for now, but Lena knew one thing. Time was not on their side. Sarah Grayson's killer was at hand, and she was determined to bring him to light, no matter how hard the truth was. The death of Sarah Grayson shook Sandwood to its core, and local authorities immediately realized that this case required immediate and thorough investigation. The city's police, accustomed to routine violations such as petty thefts and domestic disputes, were faced with something completely different. Sarah's murder was the first serious crime in decades, and every officer realized the importance of solving this case. Detective Lena Hale took charge of the investigation. Lena was known for her tireless work and insight. Over the years, she has solved many crimes, and her methodical approach to each case has earned her a reputation as one of the best detectives in the area. However, even for her, this matter was special. Sandwood was a small town, and everyone in it knew each other. Lena understood that solving this murder would not just be a matter of professional honor, but also a duty to the local community to which she herself belonged. The first thing Lena did was organize a team to investigate. Her assistants, Detectives Mark Evans and Susan Reed, were tasked with studying all the details related to Sarah's life, her environment, and the last hours before her disappearance. Susan, a young but talented specialist, specialized in the psychology of criminals. Mark, with his background in forensics, was responsible for analyzing the evidence. Together, they had to create a complete picture of what happened on the night of the murder. Lena began by interviewing Sarah's inner circle. James Grayson, despite his grief, was willing to cooperate. He talked about the last evening he saw his daughter, about her habits, friends, and recent events that could somehow affect her life. His memories were accurate and detailed, but nothing in them indicated that Sarah was in danger. She didn't complain about strange people or suspicious situations. On the contrary, her life seemed calm and happy. Mike Donovan, a family friend, was also among the first people Lena interviewed. His demeanor was calm, but Lena noticed some subtle changes in his voice and facial expressions when he talked about Sarah. Mike was one of the last people to see Sarah alive, and Lena couldn't ignore that fact. However, Mike claimed that he dropped Sarah home and did not see her after that. His testimony was consistent with what James had said, and there was no clear reason yet to doubt his words. Susan, meanwhile, studied Sarah's psychological profile. She talked with her friends, teachers, and acquaintances. Everything indicated that Sarah was an ordinary girl, with no obvious enemies or conflicts. However, some of her friends mentioned minor arguments with other teenagers, but these were normal teenage disagreements that could not lead to murder. Mark focused on the evidence found at the crime scene. The shoe prints that were found next to Sarah's body did not belong to a local resident. This fact immediately aroused suspicion, but it could also simply be a consequence of the forest being a popular place for walking and hunting. Mark sent the traces for analysis, but it took time, and so far the results have not yielded answers. In parallel with this, Lena organized an alibi check of everyone who could be connected with Sarah. Police officers carefully processed everyone who could be even remotely involved. But despite all efforts, the investigation did not move as quickly as we would like. The evidence was minimal, and the city began to experience increasing tension. People became suspicious and nervous. Each day that the case remained unsolved increased fear among residents. Lena felt growing pressure. Her own life was also intertwined with this city. Every step, every interrogation was not just work for her, but also an attempt to protect her community, to restore a lost sense of security. However, time was running out, and she knew that if she did not find a key clue, the killer could get away with impunity. One important aspect of the investigation was the examination of Sarah's phone calls and messages. Lena carefully checked the last calls that the girl made on the day of her death. Among them was one call made late in the evening before she met with Mike. This call, it turned out, was made to a number that was not recorded in her phone book. Lena began to suspect that this call could be a clue and immediately asked for information about the owner of this number. The investigation continued, and the deeper Lena plunged into Sarah's life, the more secrets were revealed. Sarah may not have been as simple as she seemed at first glance. But most importantly, Lena began to realize that the killer may be closer than anyone could have imagined. The person who was trusted, who was always there, could be the one who dealt the fatal blow. However, all the evidence was still scattered, and Lena felt that something important was eluding her. This case was like a complex puzzle where every detail mattered, and every wrong decision could lead to failure. As time passed, Lena knew she had to do everything she could to find the killer before he struck again. The first weeks of the investigation into the death of Sarah Grayson became a real test for Lena Hale and her team. Despite careful work, there were still no concrete leads or suspects. But the deeper they delved into this case, the clearer it became that the circle of people who could be involved in the murder was narrowing. And finally, the first suspects began to emerge in front of Lena and her team. Sarah's boyfriend, Thomas Miller, was called in first for questioning. Thomas was several years older than Sarah and worked as a mechanic in a nearby town. Their relationship was known to everyone, and many believed that they were the perfect couple. However, upon closer examination, Lena discovered that not everything was so smooth. Neighbors talked about quarrels that sometimes occurred between them. Some argued that Thomas was too jealous, others that Sarah had her own reasons for discontent. However, Thomas had an alibi for the night of the murder. He was at work until late in the evening, which was confirmed by his colleagues. Lena carefully checked his testimony and made sure that he really was not in Sandwood when Sarah disappeared. The next suspect was Sarah's schoolteacher, Mr. Jackson. He had a reputation as a strict but fair teacher who demanded discipline from his students. In the past, he had invited Sarah to talk after class several times, and although this did not seem unusual, Lena decided to study these meetings more closely. Conversations with Mr. Jackson's students and colleagues did not reveal anything suspicious, but Lena could not help but think that he was hiding something. There was tension in his voice during the interrogation, and his answers seemed too well rehearsed. However, as in the case of Thomas, evidence linking him to the murder was insufficient. One of the more unexpected candidates for the role of suspect was Ben Harper, the same hunter who found Sarah's body. At first he was considered only as a witness, but some of his answers aroused Lena's suspicions. Ben was known for his love of hunting and frequent walks in the woods, but Lynn was interested in his backstory. It turned out that he had had problems with the law in the past. Several years ago he was arrested for assault, but the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. Lena began to wonder if he was in the forest for a reason that morning. However, when checking his alibi and routes, Lena found nothing that directly linked him to the crime. Ben insisted that he did not know Sarah personally and had never met her before that tragic morning. Despite this, his name still remained on the list of suspects, albeit without solid evidence. However, Mike Donovan seemed the most suspicious. Even though he was a close friend of the Grayson family and supported James during this difficult period, Lena could not ignore his nervousness and strange reservations during interrogations. Mike claimed that he gave Sarah a ride home that evening, but there were no witnesses who could confirm his claims. Lena also noticed that Mike began to avoid personal meetings with her, preferring to communicate through a lawyer, which seemed very suspicious to her. He was one of the few people who had access to Sarah on the night of her murder, and his testimony became more complicated with each new interrogation. Lena began to wonder if Mike was hiding something more than just the details of that night. One of the key moments in the investigation came when Lena decided to conduct additional interviews with Sarah's close friends and family in order to gather as much information as possible about her last days. During these conversations, it became clear that a few weeks before her death, Sarah was alarmed by something but did not tell anyone about it. Her friend Jenny mentioned strange phone calls that Sarah received at night. At first, they both thought it was nothing, perhaps one of their friends playing a joke on her. But Sarah soon began to worry, and even changed her route home to avoid meeting someone she feared. After checking phone records, Lena discovered several suspicious numbers from which Sarah was called at night. These numbers did not belong to local residents and were registered under false names. But one name did emerge during the investigation. It was associated with Mike Donovan. Although it could be a coincidence, Lena felt that this thread could lead to a clue. Suspicions began to concentrate around Mike, and Lena decided to organize surveillance of him. The police tried not to attract attention, but Mike himself seemed to begin to notice that he was being watched. His behavior became increasingly strange. He began to appear in public less often, avoided meeting James, and increasingly stayed at home, behind thick curtains. Lena understood that something didn't add up in this matter. Why did Mike, who had always been a trusted friend and a person with an impeccable reputation, suddenly begin to behave so strangely? Were his actions an attempt to hide his feelings after Sarah's death, or was there something more sinister behind it? Lena knew one thing: the answers were out there, and she had to do everything she could to uncover the truth before anyone else got hurt. Thus, the circle of suspects became clearer, but at the same time, more confusing. Each of them had their own secrets, but none could yet be directly connected with the murder. Lena and her team were at a dead end, but they knew that every day they were getting closer to the solution. The killer was among them, and time was against everyone. The further the investigation progressed, the more Lena Hale felt pressure. All the work of her team boiled down to a thorough analysis of scattered traces and evidence that did not fit into the whole picture. However, despite the lack of clear evidence, Lena knew that every little observation or subtle detail could lead them to a clue. One of the first steps Lena took was to re-examine the site where Sarah's body was found. Her experience suggested that seemingly insignificant details can turn out to be decisive. Together with forensic experts, she returned to the forest where the tragedy occurred. Detectives checked every tree, every bush, step by step, hoping to find something that could shed light on how events unfolded that night. Lena's attention was drawn to footprints on the wet ground, which were mentioned as minor in the initial report. Upon reanalysis, it turned out that these were traces from 2 different pairs of shoes. This discovery became important evidence. Some of the tracks clearly belonged to Sarah, while others belonged to someone else, possibly the killer. However, the problem was that the tracks were partially washed out by the rain that fell that night, and identifying them accurately became a difficult task. Lena decided that it was necessary to conduct a more detailed analysis of these traces. She turned to one of the best forensic scientists in the state to help determine who might have left these traces. The results of the analysis showed that they belonged to a man, but more precise information could not be obtained. However, this discovery strengthened Lena's suspicions that Mike Donovan may have been involved in the crime, given his presence near Sarah that night. At the same time, Mark Evans, one of the detectives on Lena's team, was working on analyzing Sarah's phone. He managed to gain access to deleted messages and calls that had not previously been accounted for. The analysis revealed that Sarah had received strange messages on her phone several days before her death. These messages were not overtly threatening, but were strange enough to raise alarm bells. The sender was an unknown number registered under a false name. This fact alerted Lena, and she decided to follow this number to find out who could have used it. While examining the messages, Mark discovered another strange detail. Shortly before her death, Sarah wrote down an unfamiliar address in her phone. Lena immediately decided to check this place out. It turned out that the address led to an old abandoned house on the outskirts of Sandwood that had been empty for many years. This discovery seemed strange to Lena. Why did Sarah need to visit this house, and how does this relate to her death? Lena and her team went to the site to inspect the house. Inside, they found that the house had been abandoned for a long time, but something caught their attention. In one of the rooms, they found an old sofa with traces of fresh stains on it. This was an unexpected discovery that required immediate analysis. A forensic team took samples of the stains and sent them for examination. Meanwhile, Lena continued to explore the connections between the suspects and Sarah. Her attention returned to Mike Donovan. Lena decided to study his financial and telephone records. It turned out that a few days before the murder, Mike withdrew a large amount of money from his account. This raised even more suspicions as Mike claimed that he had not had any special expenses in recent weeks. In addition, In his phone records, Lena found calls to the same fake number that sent strange messages to Sarah. This circumstance strengthened her suspicions and made it possible to connect Mike with those who could threaten Sarah. When the results of the analysis of the stains found in the abandoned house came back, they confirmed Lena's worst fears. These stains turned out to be traces of blood, and DNA tests showed that it was Sarah's blood. This fact became key evidence confirming that Sarah was indeed in this house shortly before her death. Now Lena knew that this house was not a random find, but an important link in the chain of events that led to her death. Lena and her team were on the verge of a solution. All the evidence that they collected bit by bit began to add up to a single picture. Only one question remained. How did Mike Donovan, a man with an impeccable reputation, become involved in this brutal crime? And most importantly, was he the one who dealt the killing blow, or was someone else behind it? Lena understood that time was against her. Every day that the crime remained unsolved added new suffering to Sarah's family and the entire city. She was determined to bring this case to the end and bring to light everyone who was involved in the murder. But ahead of her lay even more difficult decisions and unexpected turns that could change everything she thought about this matter. As the investigation dragged on, the atmosphere in Sandwood became increasingly tense. The town, which had previously lived its calm and measured life, was now in a state of constant stress and anxiety. Every day that passed without an arrest increased the feeling of fear and mistrust among the residents. Rumors spread throughout the city with incredible speed. People began to suspect each other, and even those who had lived nearby all their lives and had known each other since childhood now looked at their neighbors with fear. Every whisper, every glance could be interpreted as suspicious. Residents of Sandwood began to lock their doors earlier, and children no longer played in the streets late into the night. Parents were afraid to let them even go to school unaccompanied. Lena Hale and her team felt pressure from all sides. They knew that the townspeople expected quick results, but the reality was much more complex. All the evidence they collected pointed to Mike Donovan, but they were missing one important element: direct evidence linking him to the murder. Lena understood that without this evidence, Mike's arrest might not have held up in court, and the criminal might have remained free. James Grayson, a grief-stricken father, felt the tension too. He was looking for answers. He wanted justice for his daughter, but every day that Lena could not provide him with concrete results only increased his pain. James was beginning to wonder if he trusted Mike too much, and if he was too blinded by friendship to notice the obvious signs. He was moving further and further away from Mike, and this did not go unnoticed by Lena. Meanwhile, local newspapers and television began to actively cover the case. Journalists, hungry for sensation, did not miss the opportunity to add fuel to the fire, creating even more noise around the investigation. They began publishing articles full of speculation and assumptions, which only increased mistrust of the police and created additional pressure on Lena. Some even began to hint that the police were hiding the truth or were incompetent in the investigation. This fueled public opinion, and the townspeople began to demand the immediate arrest of the suspect, whoever he was. Lena, despite her outward calm, felt how this pressure penetrated her work. She knew she couldn't afford to make a mistake, but every day without results felt like a step back. Her team was also starting to get impatient. Detective Mark Evans increasingly asked questions about whether it was worth continuing to pursue Mike or whether he should look for other leads. Susan Reed, who did a deep dive into the psychological analysis of the suspects, also expressed doubts that they were on the right track. Lena understood that they needed to act decisively so as not to lose confidence in the investigation. She decided to arrange a meeting with the district attorney to discuss the possibility of arresting Mike Donovan based on the evidence collected. The prosecutor, although he shared her concerns, was cautious. He reminded Lena that without solid evidence, the prosecution could collapse in court, and they were risking not only their case, but also their reputation. However, he agreed that public pressure had reached such a level that they could not wait any longer. Meanwhile, Mike Donovan himself began to notice a change in attitude towards him. He was surrounded by looks of disbelief, and some of his former friends began to avoid him. Mike realized that the shadow of suspicion over him was becoming more and more obvious, and this only intensified his nervousness. He tried to maintain calm and a normal lifestyle, but the inner fear of possible exposure did not give him peace. A split began to brew in the city. Some residents believed that Mike was innocent and that the police were simply unable to find the real killer. Others, on the contrary, were sure that he was guilty and demanded his immediate arrest. Lena realized that her actions in the coming days would be decisive. If she arrests Mike without enough evidence, it could lead to chaos. But if she continues to stall in hopes of finding new evidence, she risks losing trust and finding herself under even more pressure. Meanwhile, Lena decided to make another unexpected move. She arranged an informal meeting with Mike, ostensibly to discuss some details of his testimony. During the conversation, she tried to get more information out of him, trying to understand what was really going on in his head. Mike, feeling like he was being pushed into a corner, began to get even more nervous. Lena noticed this, but could not yet understand whether it was a consequence of his guilt or fear of being accused of something he did not do. At that moment, Lena realized that the game was becoming more and more dangerous. Mike Donovan was on the edge, and any wrong action could lead to unpredictable consequences. She knew that she had to be prepared for any outcome, and now, not only Mike's fate, but also her own career and the lives of all the residents of Sandwood depended on her decisions. The investigation was reaching a critical juncture. Lena felt that the answers were somewhere nearby, but they had to go through one more important stage in order to get what they were looking for. The truth that everyone was so hungry for, and which could turn out to be much worse than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into the murder of Sarah Grayson has already reached a critical point. Lena Hale and her team felt the truth was out there. But so far, their efforts to gather enough evidence to link Mike Donovan to the crime had failed. The town of Sandwood, under tension, became a cauldron of fear, suspicion, and mistrust. Lena understood that if a breakthrough did not occur soon, the consequences could be unpredictable. However, fate gave Lena a chance when one of Mike's former friends, with whom they once worked together, contacted her. This man, whom Lena decided to keep secret, said that he saw Mike on the night of Sarah's murder, but was afraid to act as a witness. He claimed that he saw Mike returning home late at night with bloody clothes. There was an expression of shock and horror on his face that indicated something very serious. This witness became the very link that Lena so lacked. She understood that his testimony could be decisive in the case, but she needed to convince him to officially testify. Lena arranged a meeting with this man in a secret place, away from prying eyes, and tried to convince him to make an official statement. During the conversation, the witness admitted that he was afraid of revenge from Mike, but Lena assured him of full protection from the police. After much persuasion, he agreed to testify. Meanwhile, Mark Evans continued to work with the evidence found. He decided to conduct another examination of Sarah's clothing, hoping that perhaps some traces had been missed that could directly link Mike to the murder. This analysis yielded an unexpected result. Microscopic fibers were found on Sarah's clothing that matched the material used in one of the old blankets found in Mike's house. This discovery became another important piece of evidence confirming that Mike could be involved in the murder. At the same time, Susan Reed delved into Mike's psychological analysis. Her observations indicated that Mike may have experienced strong feelings of guilt, which was reflected in his behavior. He became increasingly withdrawn and avoided communication with those who had been close to him before. Susan held several meetings with Mike's friends and acquaintances, trying to gather as much information as possible about his condition in recent weeks. These conversations confirmed her suspicions. Mike was in a state of deep psychological crisis, and his behavior became increasingly unstable. The results of these studies and the witness's testimony gave Lena enough reason to act. She contacted the district attorney and obtained an arrest warrant for Mike Donovan. But Lena understood that the arrest had to be carried out carefully in order to avoid unnecessary tension in the city and possible danger to the police themselves. On the day of the arrest, Lena's team developed a detailed plan. They decided to take Mike at his house early in the morning when he was still sleeping and did not expect this. Lena led the operation herself, wanting to personally be present during the arrest to make sure everything went smoothly. She and her team arrived at Mike's house at 5 a.m. The house was quiet. There was no light in the windows and everything seemed calm. When Lena and her team burst into the house, Mike was clearly shocked and did not understand what was happening. He tried to protest, claiming that it was some kind of mistake, but Lena remained calm. She advised him of his rights and explained that he was under arrest on suspicion of murdering Sarah Grayson. Mike seemed to be in complete confusion, but Lena saw something more in his eyes: fear and perhaps an admission of guilt. Mike was silent as he was taken to the police station. Lena was sitting next to him in the car, and the atmosphere was tense. She felt that despite the arrest, this case was not yet closed. She knew that the interrogation awaited them ahead, and she would have to get a confession from Mike, or at least a clue to what really happened on that fateful night. At the station, Mike was placed in an interrogation room. Lena decided that she would conduct the interrogation herself, knowing that it could be decisive. When she entered the room and sat down opposite Mike, she saw that he looked broken. She began the conversation calmly, without pressure, trying to instill a sense of trust in him. Lena knew that the key to the solution might lie in his mental state, and she tried to talk to him as if he were a person who found himself in a difficult situation. Mike was silent at first, but gradually began to speak. He talked about his friendship with James, his feelings for Sarah that he tried to suppress, and how it all led him to that fateful night. Lena listened attentively, trying not to interrupt him. She saw that Mike was on the verge of confession, but something else was holding him back. And then, at one point, when Mike started talking about his feelings for Sarah, he was suddenly interrupted. The same fear that Lena saw in the morning appeared in his eyes. He fell silent, lowered his head, and uttered the words that changed the course of the investigation forever. "I didn't want this to happen, but I couldn't stop." These words became a confession. Lena knew that this was not the end of the case, but now she had the key to uncovering the whole truth. Mike was guilty, but his motives and all the circumstances had yet to be clarified. The investigation had reached a new stage. And Lena understood that there was still a lot of work to be done before she could put an end to this matter. But one thing was clear. The truth was closer than ever, and justice for Sarah Grayson was on the doorstep. The interrogation of Mike Donovan was a turning point in the investigation into the murder of Sarah Grayson. Lena Hale, hearing his confession, knew that this was just the beginning. She knew there was a much more complex story behind those words than just an impulsive act of violence. Now her task was to find out all the details and bring the case to court, where the truth would come to light. Mike Donovan, despite his initial confession, was not ready to talk about the details of that fateful night. Lena realized that it was difficult for him to remember everything that happened. He felt guilty, but tried to justify his actions by saying that it was an accident, that he did not want to kill Sarah. Lena saw that he was tormented not only by a feeling of guilt, but also by fear. The fear of exposure, the fear that his life, his reputation would be destroyed. Through further questioning, Lena and her team began to discover that Mike and Sarah were much closer related than anyone thought. Mike had feelings for Sarah that he had tried to suppress for many years. These feelings were a source of internal conflict for him, especially given his friendship with James, Sarah's father. Mike knew his attraction to Sarah was wrong, but he couldn't do anything about it. On the night of the murder, Mike and Sarah met by chance. Mike saw her when she was returning home after meeting with friends. He offered to give her a ride, and Sarah, knowing Mike as her father's friend, did not see anything suspicious in this. But in the car, the atmosphere quickly changed. Mike began to talk about his feelings, and Sarah, scared, tried to leave the car. Then Mike, succumbing to impulse, grabbed her, and a struggle began, which ended tragically. Mike admitted that he didn't want it to end like this, but at that moment he lost control of himself. After he realized what had happened, he was overcome with panic. He took Sarah's body to the forest, hoping that no one would find it. He then returned home and tried to clean the car and cover all traces. He thought he could cover his tracks, but inner fear and guilt haunted him. The evidence Lena collected, including witness statements, DNA and fiber analysis, and Mike's confession allowed her to build a clear picture of events. Mike was arrested and put on trial. Lena knew that now she had another battle ahead of her. In the courtroom, she worked closely with the prosecutor to ensure the prosecution had enough evidence to secure a conviction. The trial was an important event for all of Sandwood. People who had previously doubted Mike's guilt were now shocked by his confession. The town was divided between those who believed that Mike deserved the harshest punishment and those who still tried to justify his actions, given his previous reputation and friendship with James. James Grayson, Sarah's father, had complicated feelings. He lost his daughter and at the same time learned that his best friend was responsible for her death. James couldn't understand how the person he trusted the most could betray him like that. This tragedy destroyed not only the life of his family, but also everything he believed in. He came to all court hearings, hoping to find answers and justice. The evidence presented in court was undeniable. The testimony of a witness who saw Mike on the night of the murder, DNA and fiber examinations, as well as the confession of Mike himself, left the court with no choice but to find him guilty. Mike was sentenced to a long prison term. The judge, handing down the sentence, noted that his actions were not only cruel but also treacherous towards the family to whom he should have been a friend. After the trial, Lena Hale felt that justice had finally been served, but this feeling was overshadowed by the knowledge that this tragedy had left deep wounds in the heart of Sandwood. The town, which was once a quiet and safe place, is now forever changed. People could no longer return to their former trust, and the sense of security was irretrievably lost. James Grayson, having lost not only his daughter but also his best friend, decided to leave Sandwood. He could no longer live in a place where every memory was associated with pain and loss. But before leaving, he came to Lena to thank her for her efforts and dedication. He knew that the truth, no matter how bitter it was, still had to be revealed. For Lena Hale, this investigation became one of the most difficult in her career. She understood that her work helped bring justice, but she also saw how fragile life can be in a small town where everyone knows each other. This story left its mark on her soul, reminding her that sometimes the darkest secrets are hidden behind the brightest facades. The story of Sarah Grayson and her murder has become a sad legend in Sandwood, but the truth, no matter how difficult it was, came to light. The town of Sandwood would never be the same again, but the residents knew that despite all the trials, justice had been served, and Sarah's memory would live on in their hearts.